Hi. I'm just going to do a little thinking aloud about the parallels, the whole structure of the Catholic Church, what comes from Diocletian, what comes from misuse of Jewish priesthood. But before I do that, I think that the answer is that the reason for it developing the way it did was as a competition, in other words, deliberate. But at the same time, mistaken. I mean, there are a lot of different confluences, okay? A lot of the things that ended up becoming Catholicism were due to popularity amongst the pagans. There's another whole section, grouping of things that got into Catholicism because they genuinely misunderstood the Bible. And they thought that they were obeying it. Nobody gets up in the morning and says, "Hi, I'd like to lie against the Bible today." There was a great deal, however, of stuff that came about in order to offer a familiar alternative to what the pagans had, or what the Jews had, in order to defeat both. And you can see that mindset in Irenaeus. If you read his writings, he's trying to match point for point. And his objective in doing that is to get the Valentinians to turn and go where he thinks that, if you're not going to his idea of church, then you're completely apostate. So what he wanted to do is, for everything that they had, that they said they had, he tried to find a counterpart to say, well, see, you're thinking like they had an apostolic list, so he argues with them based on the apostolic list, saying that his list was older, which is kind of a stupid argument, because it doesn't matter how old it is, it matters how right it is. And it's not right just because you say so. You have to have objective proof. But that was his argument because that was theirs. That's the point I'm making. Okay, so when you bear that in mind, it's a lot more forgivable how the stuff that got into Catholicism got there. Okay, the pagans were real big on virgins. On virginity was equated with spirituality, especially in Rome. So, you got the virgin thing, the perpetual virgin thing, because that's what the Vestal Virgin was. Was Mary a virgin when, she got pregnant? Well, yeah, of course, the Bible says so. But did she remain one? No. But they had to embellish that because in Greek culture that was more holy. So they just adopted it. And I'm going to use that continuing as an example because it illustrates the other category of why it went wrong. They didn't know how to explain how Christ could be born sinless. They didn't know how to explain it. So this was a handy way to explain it. If Mary was sinless, then Christ would be sinless. The trouble is that if Mary is sinless, then she's your Savior, really. She's Christ's Savior then. When you start making up stories, you end up creating problems. But for the undiscerning, that worked. Okay. So the Mary thing was partly to compete with the Vestal Virgin thing, and partly because they wanted to explain the virgin pregnancy and the virgin birth. They didn't have a good way to explain it, so they came up with this. Okay? So that second thing illustrates the, mistake. An honest mistake. Or maybe not so honest, but at least it was a mistake. The same thing would be said for, well, I gotta switch now to show the other dimension of this. This business about competing and familiarity and trying to draw people in, like Irenaeus is trying to do in his writings. That was a pretty practice. I mean, it was an express goal, policy goal that they followed. You know, all around Mediterranean. This was something that they found that worked, and it was like a little formula, and they all followed it. And there was almost no limit how far they would go. Now here's why I'm saying that. Diocletian adopted a very particular format of government structure, economic structure, military structure, and religious structure in order to try to unite the disparate and warring parts of the Roman Empire when he came to power. He divided provinces into dioceses. Ever heard that term? He adopted ceremonial robes and jeweled slippers and, you know, elaborate behavior. You had to kiss his ring. Everything that you see that goes on with the Pope, that's all dating back to Diocletian. And not only him, but mostly him. It was a handy framework and structure that under Constantine everybody had gotten used to, and they just adopted it. You know? Now, of course, that's not Bible. And it wasn't Jewish priesthood either. The Jewish priesthood incorporation, you know, the sort of eclectic thing that became the Roman Church. The Jewish part of it comes in with the fact of a high priest, the fact of priests below, the fact of scribes below. But the Jewish structure really wasn't very bureaucratic. You had high priest, the Sanhedrin, okay, and the scribes. And then you had all the local rabbis, each one in his own congregation. Okay, you didn't have anybody between the local rabbi and the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin had assistants who were scribes. And then at the top of the Sanhedrin was the high priest. So it was not an elaborate hierarchy, but there was a hierarchy. Okay? And the Sanhedrin voted. They determined things by, you know, in a group. The determination of the high priest was supposed to go in a certain way. He was supposed to be a son of Aaron. But by Jesus' day, that wasn't happening anymore. By Jesus' day, it was a political appointment. It started to become corrupt during the Maccabees, specifically with Jonathan, 1 Maccabees 10. And so that introduced another element into the equation of the priesthood that wasn't really there before. Although you could argue on the surface it looked like it was there. Starting with Jonathan in 1 Maccabees 10. Okay. And I think also 10 Maccabees. You have a uniting of religion and politics. The idea that the king is also the priest, which of course is Melchizedek, the promise of Christ coming, of a new priesthood. But it was usurped by the Maccabeans. It's a long story. With the guy was being bribed, and he took it. So that kind of element of political uniting of a kind of, you know, you war for God, you war for the Vatican. That whole history is kind of going back in that area, but it's also going back to Diocletian because it was the same thing. So you got the clothing, you got the ceremonial, you got the sort of what you want to call it, infrastructure, bureaucracy, hierarchy, sort of a shared thing there between the Diocletian era and the Jews. But it wasn't just that. That was, a common feature in a lot of pagan religions. We covered the virgin thing. Statuary. Statuary was a really big thing with Diocletian. Really big thing. Statuary in the ancient world in pagan religions you didn't worship the statue ever. It was always supposed to remind you of the person it represented. But people being the way they are, since the statue was your representation of you, if something happened to the statue, that was supposed to be a portent or a sign or a miracle. The Greeks were really hung up on miracles, so were the Romans. They were hung up on portents. They were very superstitious. So a lot of that poured it over into Catholicism too. That weird, almost grisly obsession with, the finger of St. James, for crying out loud. That's where that comes from. There's nothing in the Mosaic Law about that. Nothing in Judaism from that. The rituals, however, the setting of days, that's very much patterned after Judaism. Again, because church, and this is where the mistake comes in, and it's also a very convenient mistake. The church considered itself to be the successor of Israel. That was Eusebius' theme, and he set up his list. Okay, and Eusebius book 4 and book 6. When he sets up his list to demonstrate that Christianity is really as old as Abraham, that's why he does it. Okay, because he genuinely thinks church is supposed to replace Israel. They were not able to read Bible correctly, and I'm sure not a few of them understood what it meant, but they just ignored it. Because they wanted to beat the Jews. Because it was a political war. Some of the things in Catholicism are a little harder to explain. The Jews were always Trinitarian. Today's Judaism is largely not Trinitarian, but the Bible is Trinitarian, so is the Mishnah, so is the Talmud. Okay, there are references to Father, Son, and Spirit in there. Messiah is usually the word that's given to the Son. And he's not, they didn't believe it was Jesus. But they did believe there was one, and they did believe he was God-man. Okay, that was very common. Still is today. All the sects that were there at Christ's birth, all of us, we all date back to that. So you can't argue that one's better than another based on age, and it's a stupid argument. Because paganism is older than all of us. And it's a lie. So the statuary is obviously Roman, but it doesn't have this worship graven image thing that's often argued against the Catholic Church. It was designed to teach, it was designed to remind, it was designed to honor. Okay? That doesn't stop some ding-dongs looking at a salt stain, okay, underneath the Chicago freeway, and saying that was the Virgin Mary making an appearance. People make up their own goofball stuff. They don't need help from the Catholic Church or anybody else. The thing about the healings and the miracles, well, that's human nature. Every culture has that kind of nonsense. I'm trying to think. I think I've pretty much exhausted the main things that are distinctive about Catholicism, and hopefully I've been able to explain, the parallels. And as you'll see, these parallels are not really coming from the Bible. They're coming from their idea of Judaism and their idea of, the paganism in Rome, specifically Rome. Because, it's just all over the place. Once you know what Diocletian did and you know about his period, Constantine aped everything Diocletian did. And naturally the church aped that structure. And it was convenient. And it was helpful. And it got the crowds in. And just like, Irenaeus was hoping that if he made it attractive and offered a familiar counterpart to what the Valentinians were saying, like ex cathedra, that's the counter to oral Torah. See? So hopefully I've given you little highlights to show that there is a formation that took place, and it took place gradually, of different so-called doctrines and ideas that really didn't come from the Bible, but they weren't, it wasn't a conspiracy. Yes, it was political. Yes, it was a fight. Yes, they were organized, but it wasn't a conspiracy. Doesn't make it right. But it was piecemeal, and in each case, there's different reasons for it. Signing.